media YouTube channel and some on my own Everyday Analysis channel. Welcome to both of you, and also people watching later. I'm Alfie. I'm the editor of Sublation magazine and the host of Everyday Analysis, which is a sort of pamphlet publishing house and events series based in and around London. We are doing a special event here, as you can see, with these heads on screen, all around Benjamin Studebaker's new work. I'll just mention that he's also done a pamphlet for us, which is being printed this month, and that will be available. It kind of collects his recent essays, which are all about the revolutionary subject and how it functions today in unique and different ways. It's an extremely interesting read, and you guys can just click on the link below and check that out as well. But we are mainly here to talk about Ben's latest book. Benjamin is, I think, one of the most important sort of voices in political theory, and he has a podcast called The Lack, which he's been doing for a long, long time, and his new book, which is his first, I think he's got two books coming out pretty close together. The one that's already out is this called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, which basically argues that we're in a new type of critical moment for the question of democracy, and he tries to kind of rethink it from a kind of leftist perspective. We've also got here three very other individuals whose work on and around the left I most admire. Chris Cutrone, who teaches at the Art Institute of School of the Art Institute Chicago, and also is one of the leading and most important figures in the Platypus Affiliated Society, and also as a critique of the left from the left, which has been Chris's thing, and obviously most Sublation viewers will be already fans, so I don't need to say too much. Also with us, Geoff Schullenberger, probably again also known to most of our viewers, the managing editor of Compact magazine, and also a fantastic writer and journalist as well, whose recent stuff, where you can find in mostly Compact, but also lots of other places, and is kind of critical to this emerging, this critique of both the left and the right that we'll probably be getting into here. And then finally, Alex Hochuli, coming to us from Brazil, no doubt, co-host of the Orfei Bunga Bunga podcast, which is one of the best podcasts on politics that there is, but also a writer, published, I don't know if you have been recently in Compact, but you've certainly been in Sublation, several other places. Probably, again, most people know his work. So I'm going to now get rid of four of these lovely heads, and you're going to hear from Benjamin Studebaker himself first. He's going to talk for a little while about the broad ideas explored in his book and the surrounding material he's done. Then we're going to all jump back on. I'm going to keep myself very quiet, and these other three political experts are going to sort of chip in response to Ben's talk, and then we'll have some general chat and debate. Okay, so thanks so much to all of you for coming. It's extremely appreciated. And we're going to hand over to you, Ben, for as long as you want, so take it away.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I'm really appreciative of all of you, Alfie, for putting this together, and all of you listening. I'm really grateful for the level of interest in my stuff. This book is kind of a fusion of two worlds. There's the academic work I did at Cambridge, where I studied under David Runciman and Helen Thompson, and the political work I did in the 10s, mainly through my blog and my podcasts. But these things have more in common than you might think. And when I came to Cambridge, I had done a master's thesis at University of Chicago. It was called The Return of Depression Politics. And it very much interpreted the post-2008 moment through a kind of 30s historical analogy. And my supervisor at University of Chicago, said, this deserves the highest grade I could possibly give it. He gave me a really sterling reference. He was very kind to me. And I get to Cambridge and I go in to meet David. And the first thing David says to me really is it's all well and good to have thought about how this moment might be like previous moments, but how's it different? And that question really changed my entire trajectory. I think without that, I was at Chicago in 2013 to 2014, coming out with a comparison of contemporary American politics, the politics of the 30s in 2013-14. That would have been prescient and probably could have been a very effective way for me to get in with the mainstream current in political theory. But instead, because of David Runciman, I went in a different direction and became much more focused on what's distinctive about now, on how now is different. And that not only changed my academic work, it changed my approach to contemporary politics. And really, I think has put my life on a whole different track from what it otherwise would have been. So I'm very grateful to David for asking me that question and forcing me to think about it. The book itself is written at a high school reading level, and the style is purposefully not overly difficult. It's really, I've really tried very hard to keep it simple stylistically. The core idea is that in the United States, the economic system is producing a lot of psychological stress. This stress undermines our confidence in the American political system, but it has not produced much interest in revolutionary politics or in alternative political systems. This is a weird situation. Usually when people feel the political system is not working, they try to change it. But we don't do this. Why? The book starts with the economic situation, which I really characterize as intense capital mobility. And by capital mobility, I just mean it's very easy to move money around the world from place to place. So this gives wealthy oligarchs and transnational corporations who own a lot of mobile assets, a lot of power, at the expense of governments, which are fixed in place, territorially in place, and ordinary citizens who can move around the world only with great difficulty, only to certain places at certain times, and only with certain permissions. Governments increasingly compete for revenue and investment, and citizens compete with each other for access to quality jobs, while oligarchs and corporations are free to locate where they get the best deals. And this has made a situation that already favored rich people to begin with favor rich people much, much, much more than I think has ever been the case in the past. It generates all kinds of perverse incentives. It's hard for governments to raise revenue because if they raise taxes, the investment and the jobs goes elsewhere. It's hard for workers to demand wage increases because if they do, they have to worry about their jobs going somewhere else. It's hard for public services and infrastructure to receive adequate state investment. Those things cover specific territories, specific areas, and money is not necessarily going to come to where there is a need to build stuff. It's going to go wherever it is that it can get the highest rate of return. Often on the left, this capital mobility has been treated as if the United States creates it, as if it's a political project of the United States to, say, spread liberalism all over the world. So it's often argued that if the United States were to become less powerful in a geostrategic sense, it will become possible to overcome the incentives that capital mobility generates. So in this way, those incentives are treated as a consequence of the United States' political position rather than a function of the global economy. But in this book, I emphasize the degree to which even the United States is increasingly bound by this system of capital mobility, the degree to which even the United States has lost a lot of its ability to control this system or influence it. So in this way, I characterize capital mobility as an impersonal force that supervenes upon territorial states and upon politics. The government can take action to cope with capital mobility and its consequences, but it can't end this mobility or govern it. So as the government struggles to cope with this mobility, the policies it embraces to help itself cope inflict stress on its citizens. Real wages stagnate, basic needs are increasingly difficult to meet, family and community structures disintegrate, and voters who are under all of this stress start looking for enemies to blame. They start looking for someone or something that is the cause that can be singled out. So the workers, which in my book are the people who don't go to college specifically, they struggle to get good information about what's going on. Union membership rates have plummeted, and low wages mean workers have very little time or energy to sort out what's going on. They have to work very long hours, very limited wages. They're aren't a whole lot of media outlets or platforms that are controlled by workers themselves. So a lot of the media content that they get is made by other classes who don't necessarily share their interests or concerns or priorities. And this makes them vulnerable to conspiracy theories that blame foreigners and outgroups and mysterious, shadowy figures or cabals. The professionals, which in my book are the people who do go to college, the workers who do go to college, they increasingly struggle to obtain the benefits of a college degree. They find it hard to get jobs related to their majors. They're burdened with student debt. And this forces them to take whatever work is available, even if it forces them to move far from home, or leaves them too poor to buy a house, or unable to replicate the family situation that they themselves enjoyed when they were a kid. So without the economic benefits that a college degree historically bestows, the university degree becomes less a way of making money and more of a status marker. So it becomes important to these citizens to have the right takes on cultural issues and foreign policy. That's how they distinguish themselves from other workers who have a similar standard of living but haven't been to college and haven't received the cultural education and the socialization. So in my book, the rump professionals are the successful minority of college-educated workers who get the prestige jobs, who are really able to do the kind of work that they envisioned when they made the decision to go to college. These rump professionals work mainly for oligarchs and transnational corporations. They make most of the media content. They run for office. They serve in the civil service. And they direct the search for blame. They are the ones who tell the workers to blame foreigners and outgroups. At the same time, they also tell the fallen professionals, the declassed, downwardly mobile college-educated workers, they tell them to blame the people who aren't educated and don't have college degrees. In this way, they pit traditional workers and college-educated workers against each other. Then you've got the small business owners, and they depend very much on local economic conditions. They need people in their local communities to make good money. They can't sell their products overseas. They need the American economy to work. So when workers and professionals' positions worsen, the small business owners also feel increasingly insecure. But because the small business owners are employers, they're reluctant to support wage and tax hikes because those things would in the near term make their situation even worse. So their anxiety is instead channeled in a cultural direction by the political right. The right blames foreigners for negatively influencing American culture, especially immigrants and refugees, but also foreign ideologies like Marxism. The left blames the right, labeling the right fascist, racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on. The center denies that any real problem exists and blames social media and the Russians for polluting the discourse with fake news. So none of these classes and political movements fully grasp the impersonal character of capital mobility. Instead, they make friend-enemy distinctions and they give language and discourse primacy over material reality. And even insofar as the capital mobility problem is understood, politicians find it very hard to do anything about it. The economic and political costs of unilaterally withdrawing from the system of capital mobility are very high. If you cut these links with other economies, you'll get inflation, you'll get shortages of goods. COVID-19 was just a tiny taste of the shortages and inflation that you would get if you really made an effort to withdraw from this system. Even during the pandemic, the trade volume that the United States had with other states was incredibly high. There was more trade in 2020 than in 2016, for instance. At the same time, it's very hard for governments that are subject to election cycles to come together and coordinate a multilateral response to create new structures, new international or supranational institutions to govern the flows of money. So when you do elect a government that's interested in this, too often those governments find themselves isolated internationally with no friends or partners to work with. They get backed up against a wall and then they capitulate. So because politicians struggle to solve the capital mobility problem, they have really strong incentives to frame the problem in cultural terms. It's much easier to win elections by waging culture war. And because the culture war is focused around lightning rod, touchstone issues related to race, religion, and gender, the media cannot avoid it. It generates too many clicks and too much revenue. Political content is now firmly a part of the culture industry and subject to all of those Adorno-era critiques of that industry. This is, of course, what oligarchs and transnational corporations want politicians and media personalities to do anyway. They want them to talk about other stuff and not about the economy and not about global trade. And so they will happily support anybody who's willing to play this game. They'll make donations, they'll provide grants, they'll buy ads to encourage the political class to follow these incentives where they lead. And in this way, they are pushing in the direction where the structure is already dragging all of us. So the effect of this is that we no longer talk about the economy in its actually existing 21st century form. We can't really imagine any other way of running the economy. And when the economy becomes overtly dysfunctional, we don't really think seriously about restructuring it. In this sense, our minds and imaginations have been captured by the electoral logic of the American democratic system and by the market logic of the political culture industry. So while we become increasingly miserable and dissatisfied with the political system and with the discourse, we are unable to think beyond it. This means that when there is an economic upheaval like 2008 or the pandemic, citizens do not seriously consider revolutionary action. Instead, they can be bought off with small stimulus checks, PPP loans. If you poll people, they'll say that the system is dysfunctional and it needs to be changed, but they'll very much oppose any particular proposal that you throw out that strikes them as authoritarian. They express warm feelings for the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and very negative attitudes toward Russia, China, Iran, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. But while nobody rejects democracy, the dissatisfaction with democracy is politically expressed in the form of new, deep disagreements about what democracy means or ought to mean. So increasingly, we're fighting with each other over the meanings of terms like liberty, equality, and representation. We're fighting over what democracy itself means and how democracy should be procedurally instantiated. We no longer have a shared understanding of how democracy ought to work. And so when we are confronted with other people's understandings of democracy, these understandings often appear authoritarian to us, and we put anachronistic 20th century labels on these interpretations, calling them fascist or communist or what have you. When really, in 2020, for instance, the dispute was over whether the electoral laws should be reformed to make it easier to vote absentee during the pandemic. A very trivial matter, and yet one that generated so much disagreement that the two sides came to view one another as thieves attempting to steal an election. The narrative that the left and the right menace democracy with authoritarianism, when they do not even pose an authentic threat to capital mobility, is now a disciplinary tactic that the center uses to stay in power, depicting ineffective, poorly organized protesters as would-be coup artists. All dissent, no matter how ineffective or even counterproductive, is now framed as posing a threat to democracy, and you are morally obligated to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans, depending on the understanding of democracy to which you subscribe. If you refuse, you're aiding and abetting the bad people. The result is a legitimacy crisis that is at the same time accompanied by extraordinary stagnancy, a kind of legitimacy crisis that flies completely in the face of Jürgen Habermas's theory, in which contradictions necessarily lead to demands for democratization that take a single progressive form. We instead have a proliferation of understandings of democracy and of democratic values, and instead of getting rid of dissent, the political system proliferates dissent and then pits all the different forms of dissent against each other. Academics have tried to referee these debates. They try to normatively argue for particular understandings of democracy, liberty, equality, and representation. Failing that, they try to offer curated menus of understandings based on readings of the history of political thought. But academics who believe they can control or even meaningfully influence this contestation deceive themselves. The universities are themselves in the hands of oligarchs and corporations. The conceptualizations that receive the backing of the university system are those that attract grant money, and those that produce workers, oligarchs, and corporations are inclined to hire. And even the university system itself has limited influence because most Americans are never really properly exposed to it. Many don't go to college. Many who do go to college don't take classes in the social sciences or the humanities. And many introductory classes in the social sciences and humanities avoid controversy to avoid attracting negative attention from their sources of funding. So in practice, the people who really become comfortable with the university-sanctioned iterations of the liberal democratic terms are a relatively narrow slice of the people, those who major in the social sciences and humanities, and those who pursue these subjects in graduate school. The effect is to create cultural and political estrangement between these college-educated people and the majority of Americans. And when these college-educated people become hyper-political and focused on very intense political contestation occurring in every aspect of the society, in every institution and space, the majority of Americans actively seek refuge from that. They try to get away from and hide from a political discourse that they recognize as alienating and hostile to them. The left and the right are in this way professional class phenomena, while the working class is a kind of subaltern. It lacks the political capacities that are ascribed to it. It can't really speak, it can only be spoken for. And the left and the right constantly speak for it, claiming to represent it, when really, I think the bulk of the workers would just like to get away from all of this. In 2020, 81 million adults voted for Joe Biden, 74 million adults voted for Trump, around 3 million voted third party. And in all of those cases, many of the people who did it only because they were afraid and not because they liked any of what was on the menu. Even beyond that, 100 million adults that year did not vote at all. These adults understood they had nothing to hope for, nothing to fear from the result. They recognized the election as something external to them and to their interests. It's my contention that the reaction I ascribe to these people, I call it despair. Despair is the correct reaction. It's how we should feel about the system. It should give us despair. So the purpose of my book is to create a feeling of despair in the reader by enacting a relentless assault on all forms of hope and fear that pervade American politics and keep us from moving beyond liberal institutions, liberal concepts, and liberal political forms. The primary function of actually existing liberalism is to sustain the system of capital mobility, and in the course of sustaining it, to debilitate workers and professionals until they are unable to perform basic political functions. Once this is achieved, they will then be blamed for the fact that they have fallen into this condition. This becomes an excuse not merely to remove the economic system from democratic control, but to depoliticize it and make it an abstract matter, an abstract master even, one to which even the oligarchs are themselves subject. But this subjection never becomes real for the oligarchs because on the surface, it's compatible with their desires. They can accumulate more capital and more money, even as they become increasingly ignorant of non-instrumental forms of value, increasingly unable even to understand what it is that they're excluding, rejecting, and leaving behind. Even as it becomes more difficult to articulate values, much less pursue them, there are still many people who keep trying to do this. They realize they cannot pursue their values through democracy and through the market, and they instead try to pursue their values outside of politics through the private sphere. So in the book, I lay out 4 different enclaves into which these people attempt to retreat. I call them the 4 Fs: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism. All of these Fs point toward other worlds, another spiritual world, the very small world of the household, the fictitious world of the fandom, and the ever-delayed world of the future. But each of these other worlds still relies on this one. It takes time, energy, and resources to participate in these spheres, and the political system and the workplace are always competing for all available time, energy, and resources. So as workers and fallen professionals sink into increasingly poor material situations, they increasingly lack the resources to participate effectively in the 4 Fs, to participate in civil society or in the private sphere. To make matters worse, political professionals go into these enclaves and they seek both to marketize them and to politicize them. In this way, they seek to infect these enclaves to force the people who have retreated into them to politically reactivate, to come back to politics and democracy and to vote. The effect of these economic and political changes is to ruin the 4 Fs as well over time, to slowly make it impossible for people to realize their values even in the private sphere. None of this becomes real or vital for the professionals who are absorbed in the culture war and do not see the degree to which American democracy is increasingly a system that functions on the premise that large swathes of the population will be continuously in despair and have to be hounded and psychologically harassed to extract political participation from them. Instead, a stream of gifted kids fancy themselves saviors of this system, immersing themselves in the writings of the founding fathers, in public policy, in political writings, both esoteric and mainstream. They persuade themselves that they can succeed where others have failed, that they have a special destiny about them, that they can refound the republic in some way, like a Lycurgus or like Machiavelli's refounder. This messianic, quixotic attitude prevents these people from coming face to face with the degree to which the system has truly become dysfunctional. They have a kind of main character energy that blinds them and drives them to waste their lives. It is for this reason that the book bears the subtitle, The Way is Shut. In The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn seeks to raise an army of the dead to battle Sauron. And to find these men, he must take the paths of the dead. All who take these paths find only death and ruin. But because Aragorn has a special destiny and a cool sword, the dead answer to him and him alone. Today, there are so many who imagine that they are Aragorn and that the American political system can be made to answer to them. But really, they are following the same paths that led previous generations to failure and irrelevance. So many have tried to rise above the ordinary people on the ground, thinking that if they can rise, they will be able to see a way to help the people on the ground that those people themselves cannot see. But the higher they rise, the more out of touch they become, and the less relevant their advice becomes. As they rise higher and higher, they become more interested in competing with each other than they are in helping the people on the ground. They can no longer see the people on the ground. The suffering of the people on the ground becomes abstract to them. And in time, the people on the ground grow to resent those who have risen and even to fear them. For the people on the ground come to know that those who lurk in the sky only pretend to aid them, but will in due course abandon them or even put them in harm's way, all the while insisting that they are good and heroic and dare to help. We, as academics, are sky people, and our impulses are all wrong. We think we should be arguing about what democracy, liberty, equality, and representation ought to mean, but none of this helps them. None of it is really for them. It is only for us, for we are not Aragorn. We are the ring-wraiths, and they are right to treat us scornfully, for we lead them only into torment. The American political system was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it. The way is shut. That's the book.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, let me bring everyone back on. That was absolutely, very compelling, Ben, and I could see there was a lot. There's thousands of comments, etc. If people, I did notice one issue with one of the streams. They are running, but one link is redirecting to the wrong place. So I put some notes in there, and those people should be sort of trickling over. So anyway, thanks so much to all the people that are here and all these fantastic comments. It's great. And although I have things to say, I'm not going to say them. I'm going to just make the most of our time by going to the more interesting people. And I thought I just give you each a chance to sort of give an initial response, either to what Ben said today or to your own thoughts on his book or just these themes, and I'll just go in order of how people are on the screen. So we'll start with Chris, then Geoff, then Alex, and then we can just have a sort of free for all from there. So over to you, Chris, if you want to go first. I can't hear you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I had muted myself. I'm sorry.
Okay, you're there.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So you brought up, Ben, one of the themes in the book, the 4 Fs, right? And I'm not sure that everyone heard you clearly. Fandom, right? And I'm always aware of the fact that maybe the left is just fandom, and the right too, right? In terms of an intellectual culture. So I just wanted to sort of clarify that point in case people didn't follow exactly what you were saying. But that struck me in my reading of your book. Also, in your comments today, you were talking about getting beyond liberalism And I was thinking about it in terms of really beyond neoliberalism, right? Because liberalism was not always an apology for capitalism. Progressive liberalism brought about the social democratic welfare state of the pre-neoliberal era. And also, I'm always thinking about the kind of fear of the future, like the dynamics that we're in and where it seems to be leading us, might actually be a picture of the past. In other words, what we anticipate might happen going forward, actually, maybe that's what's already happened in the last 50 years. And you also said, we're all academics. I know that you meant that not literally, but rather figuratively. And there's a chapter in your book called "The Guys in the Hot Air Balloons," in which you talk about just what you ended on just now, the kind of predicament and the kind of false start or misleading character of intellectuals, the role of intellectuals. And so I was thinking about it in terms of Marxism, and if Marxism has very little to do with the working class, still it attracts intellectuals. And is there any potential there beyond a kind of diluted ideology or a kind of overheated rhetoric that you see on the left? That's what Marxism usually amounts to, a kind of tormented liberalism or something along those lines, at least a tormented progressivism. And in your book, you raised one of the reasons why you say the way is shut, or the impossibility of reform. It's a different narrative than is usually given. It's not like just the two-party system or something like that. One of the things that you highlight that I fear might get neglected is with respect to globalization. And you say that for serious reform to take place, it would have to take place in, for instance, both the United States and China simultaneously. Otherwise, it will lead to World War III. Right? That's the way you put it. And so it, sort of raises this question of, is this a local crisis of American democracy? Is it a global crisis? What's the nature of that crisis? You bring up Habermas's category, legitimation crisis, which is from the 60s. And maybe we have come full circle. Maybe in the 60s and 70s, there was a legitimation crisis, and we really haven't had one since then until now. And that crisis will pass. It will pass. It will be resolved somehow. Right? Capitalism will keep going. But the question is whether that kind of a crisis, and it's a crisis that's not local, it's a crisis seen around the world, and potentially even in a place like China that has like a totalitarian system or whatnot. We shouldn't forget the Soviet Union fell. These things happen. And in that respect, maybe we're not going to be able to do anything in the present crisis. Maybe that crisis is already passed. But what about preparing for the future? What about preparing for a future crisis? What about the role of intellectuals in preparing the resources for people in the next crisis, which might not be for 30 or 40 years? Right? I was in a conversation for Sublation with Sohrab Ahmari of Compact in New York in August. And he said, well, that will be the 2080s, and it won't matter to me anymore, or even potentially his children. I thought, well, no, it's going to affect your children, right? It's not his concern. And I find myself thinking, perhaps that is my concern. What legacy am I leaving intellectually with respect to a potential future crisis that will come back around, right? And the academic leftism, the culture that we're kind of used to, that's probably finished. Meaning, it seems like academia is going to be gutted of the humanities and social sciences in such a way that the home that the academic left has had will be gone, right? But presumably intellectual life will not cease, right? So what is the role of intellectuals? If we're not going to be guys in the hot air balloon, if we're not going to be the ring wraiths that I don't know, suck all the intellectual life out of things and make it instantly dead? Is there anything else we might do? Or are we just going to kind of condemn ourselves in our present bankruptcy? Those are my thoughts.
That's great. I mean, I think what we'll do, Ben, do you want to have a little response, and then we'll go back and forth like that and so on. So you do respond, yeah.
Oh, great. That helps because there's going to be so much. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, those are really great questions. Yeah. So I think that one of the things I'm seeing a lot of is a kind of return liberalism, a kind of Samuel Moyn, we have to go back to liberalism before the Cold War or before the interwar period, a kind of 19th century or 18th century liberalism and recover it in some way, which strikes me as a kind of anachronistic attempt to return to a previous epoch. It seems very reactionary to me. I do think that there are things that we can do if we get out from under this thought that we have to in some way fulfill the project of people from 200 years ago or 300 years ago. If we can kind of, not that we throw all of that out or that we don't engage with it, but if we can kind of cut our dependence on that tradition and be more syncretic and bring more different things together, we might get some new ideas. And then we might be able to produce some stuff that could be useful to people in the future. I do think that that's something we could do, but I think before we can do that, we have to have this despair moment where we confront futility. And what I'm seeing is that most of the people who are participating in the contemporary political conversation are doing return politics. And especially the liberals are doing it, more so than the right, more so than the conservatives. The conservatives are always being accused of being returnists, but it's the liberals who are really doing it. And the left, insofar as it is constantly trying to make an alliance with the liberals because it thinks that that's the only kind of alliance that is permitted to it, is also succumbing to that return impulse all the time. So I want to get us past that or out of that. And I think to do that, we have to have a dark moment where we come face to face with an abyss. And then once we process that, then I'm hoping that we can be more generative and more creative again and come up with new ways of doing academic work outside of the failing institutions.
Yeah, no, it's extremely interesting. Okay, well let's keep going, and then we'll just all discuss together shortly. So we'll have Geoff's thoughts next, if that's all right with you, Geoff.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks so much, Ben. It's a great book, as you said. I mean, I think the lucidity of it is really striking on almost every page. So I just really strongly recommend it. It makes you think very seriously, but also just reads very sort of breezily, which is an unusual combination. So I think it's an impressive work. One thing that I was struck by is the question of imagination. And I say that because the very last paragraph of the book begins with a sentence that I want to read directly from the text, just so I don't get it wrong. The American political system is attacking our imagination. So I was struck by that in part because as I was reading the whole book, I don't think the term actually comes up that many times. And I was actually struck by its absence in a way because I'm familiar, I feel like I've read deeply in various kind of leftist analysis that's very focused on this question of imagination. We might think of like Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. We might think of David Graeber's work, right? All of which is kind of focused on this idea that our stuckness, our political, impasse is in some sense tied to a failure of imagination and the fact that we can't imagine our way out of the situation that we're in. And one thing that struck me about this book as I was reading it was that it sort of gives this extremely, as I said, lucid and detailed portrait of this kind of stuckness and this impasse, but doesn't really appeal to this problem of we can't imagine an alternative to capitalism, right? We can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine an alternative to capitalism as the sort of much shared uh, adage goes. And so then it struck me that you actually conclude on this note of imagination and with this formulation of, that the system is attacking our imagination. So that kind of leads me to a second point, and so that just struck me, and I wouldn't mind hearing maybe a bit more from you about, how this question of imagination fits into your project, because it's been so central to these other accounts of stuckness, that I think all of us are familiar with. And then, this other point, which is that, there's kind of this assertion of agency on the part of the American political system, right? So the American political system is the subject of the sentence. So it has a kind of active agency in this formulation, and quite active in that it's doing this thing of attacking. And that sort of made me think back to another aspect of the book, which you mentioned in your summary, which is this question of conspiracy theory, right? That basically, people are facing this situation of despair, of not being able to explain the sort of, and this is kind of a standard and I think useful way of thinking about conspiracy theory, right? That it's an attempt to kind of ascribe agency to a system that is highly abstract, right? This is basically sort of Frederick Jameson's notion of conspiracy theory as a kind of cognitive mapping. And so it sort of ties into this question of imagination in a sense, right? That the conspiracy theory is a sort of imaginative attempt to ascribe agency. And so, clearly, and so, yeah, it's familiar. It's a sort of familiar idea that, what conspiracy theory does is you're confronted with a situation where there are all these kind of, there's this abstract constellation and all of these moving parts, and you want to figure out, like, what's the mover behind that? What's the thing that is kind of moving all the pieces, right? What's the puppet master or whatever? And so, I think what's kind of interesting about your account is that it does kind of leave this question of agency often, highly diffuse, and and it's interesting that, again, the agent or the subject of the sentence is a system, right? So it is this kind of notion of systemic or kind of structurally distributed agency. And so that was kind of another thing that stood out to me in all of this. And then, I mean, a third thing that I thought was kind of interesting, just as I was comparing this to other, kind of, and the way it differs from more familiar kind of leftist accounts that, essentially at this point I've been familiar with like my whole conscious life, that you have an interesting way of accounting for dissent and how dissent can, continue to feed the functioning of the system rather than subvert it, right? And it takes me back to this phrase, the original like Baffler magazine. I think the phrase was "commodify your dissent," right? And so this idea that the problem with dissent is that there was this point at which it was sort of authentically subversive, but then it somehow became commodified. And so another thing that kind of struck me here is that you have an account that I think doesn't rely on that notion of dissent being commodified, right? That in a sense the dissent can be as authentic as you want it to be, but nonetheless it's still and again, just going back to that final paragraph, I think you point to that, right? You say it as in the American system finds ways to turn even seemingly radical subversive critiques to its advantage. So again, there's kind of this certain similarity to this familiar idea, but at the same time, I think it's avoiding any kind of question of authenticity, right? That there isn't really a question of, the problem with your dissent is that it's not authentic. It's that it's been commodified, and so instead, it's more just again a kind of structural account of how this happens, and the dissent can be as authentic as you want it to be, but can still sort of as you're describing, be sort of made useful in order for the system to preserve its own stability. And so I don't know, those are just kind of what struck me as a few related questions that partly tied to ways that I don't think you're sort of directly critiquing these previous lines of sort of left-wing analysis, but I think those are all kind of interesting and subtle ways that your book continues these lines of questioning, but I think turns them in a somewhat different direction. But I'm also curious, what your thoughts are about this question of agency, and also, how imagination, as I said, kind of fits into this model, because it does, again, strikingly appear in the closing paragraph of the book.
Yeah, I try very hard to not moralize and put blame or shame on particular individuals. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt whenever I can. As a political theorist, I think that most of the time it's not necessary to attribute ill intent to people to have a good working explanation of what's going on. That's not to say everybody has good intentions, but I think that once you start thinking about what are people's intentions and whether they mean well, this has an effect on you that gradually takes you further and further away from what you really want to think about, and more into the friend-enemy dynamic and the hostile kind of thinking, which is easily assimilated by the system. So, yeah, I am very structural all the time, deliberately. I put a lot more influence in this book on democracy than on capitalism. I think that a big part of why we can't imagine alternatives to capitalism is that we are stuck on particular political forms that are incompatible with actually moving beyond capitalism. I think that there's an assumption often that people have that democracy and capitalism are opposing forces, and that by going into democracy, you will get out of capitalism. But you can have some kind of pure democracy that isn't internally divided against itself, has no tensions. There's a section in the book where I talk about revolution, and the Zizek point is, of revolution being an attempt to have capitalism without contradictions. I think today what really marks a lot of left-wing thinking is an attempt to have democracy without contradictions, which seems to me to be just as impossible, and impossible because the kind of democracy that we have and the kind of capitalism that we have are mutually enmeshed and bound with each other. So if you have a critique of capitalism but not a critique of democracy, you will not properly be able to imagine an alternative to capitalism, because every time you try to get out of capitalism, you will reproduce it through your commitment to democracy. And therefore, we have to be critical of democracy. And where a lot of people stop is they'll be critical of representative democracy, but then they'll propose some kind of rad dem solution, some kind of workplace democracy co-op solution. And this ends up getting you right back where you started, with a bunch of extra steps that waste everybody's time. And so I'm trying to get us to be not just economically imaginative, but politically imaginative. Because I think until we are politically imaginative, until we're really willing to say that we have a system that fundamentally doesn't work on the political level, we aren't going to actually be able to do anything with our economic imaginations. And I think if you look around, there are a lot of individually interesting proposals for how to reorganize different sectors of the economy. It's just everyone knows when they read these proposals that they can't go anywhere politically. They're not politically feasible. You can't actually do anything with them. People talk all the time about, wouldn't it be great if you could take certain natural monopolies and turn them into monopolies, or wouldn't it be great if you could create a kind of big public sector algorithmic thing that handles, say, the creation of art or entertainment in a kind of content neutral way. People come up with these kinds of proposals, and you can do it, but you then immediately run into this feasibility problem. Thomas Piketty, with his global wealth tax and his regional, there are things you could do that would change the situation, but they're not feasible. And then even the little piddling, Joe Biden, Build Back Better reforms, those aren't even feasible. So you just keep going down and down the list, and more concessions are made to, but the political system doesn't allow it, and the political system is untouchable. And the effect of this is to kill the economic imagining that we have had. And I think we've had a lot of that. What we haven't had is political imagination.
Great. Okay, great. Alex, lastly, but of course not least, over to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, Benjamin already knows that I really liked his book and admired its clarity and elegance. I would just echo what other people have already said. I agree with all those things. It's definitely a very good book. I want to firstly start with talking about this idea of hopelessness, that we moved from, despair to despondency. I don't think those are exactly your words, Benjamin, but that, you know, I mean, in Brazil, there's been a bit of a cliche kind of saying that emerged over the past years, which is like the bottom of the well is always further, right? So that I'm not sure that there is a moment of total disenchantment with the things that the political system tries to sell you, and that where you kind of hit rock bottom and then kind of reassess this moment of clarity, not least because the system, as I think you kind of at least tacitly recognize in the book, is always trying to sell you new little forms of hope or kind of recompenses for engagement. But, you know, you can still be completely despondent and tweet something and get some likes for it and feel like something's happening, something good is happening. So I'm not sure where this, I worry about that being a sort of deus ex machina, that we're like, you hit rock bottom and now we see clearly. Then the reality is an accelerated, you know, you want to talk about kind of whether we're in a new sort of era and whether we should dispense with historical analogies. I think one of the most remarkable things is the accelerated pace of everything, which maybe impedes even the sort of political deliberation, which we presume us kind of left-wing academics or whatever thinkers is possible of even taking place. And that's really troubling, right? But we're effectively in a tumble dryer. So, you know, you try to stay still and try to build something, and the thing just flips around every once in a while and throws the clothes upside down again. And that's quite difficult. And I think, I mean, the response at that, I think I agree with, you know, Chris in terms of being long-termist. No one else is, there's no force, capitalism itself, no political agent, no one is being long-termist today. So if any, and that is essential. So it falls on us, I guess, if we want to do this, you know, to be long-termist. But I worry on the other side of a certain quietism in that, of merely just kind of preparing the ground and of a kind of political, you know, indifference at the same time. To kind of wind my way towards a question, I think one of the elegant things in your book is the way that you describe at a systemic and a structural way, the way that the return of politics has been absorbed by the system very effectively, not to neuter dissent or in the kind of post-political mode of removing political decisions from contestation, but to actually use contestation as a way of neutralizing things, right? Basically get everyone just shouting at each other and nothing will really change. And the way that this is not just the liberal elite doing it to the plebs or alternatively, but that there are two poles in this system which mutually kind of reproduce each other and act off of each other. And this form of polarization in which both sides play the plebeian populist, both sides play the victim, both sides act like they're not in power, as a way of reproducing this dynamic in which you can pretend to be, abnegate your own agency, right? You're the victim here. Right-wing conservatives are oppressing you, or the libs are, stopping you from getting off somehow. And this is the way the system works. But I would go further and say that it's not just on matters of kind of gender and race and whatever. This is the way this kind of form of culture war 2.0 applies to issues across the board. So issues which are not kind of traditional culture war moral issues, nor the new identity politics, but even something like climate or immigration, which need not be racialized in any way, itself gets immediately reframed into this culture war mode and impedes any sort of progress, let alone sort of alliances, not between kind of institutional actors, but just between people who are interested in politics, but who might come from kind of different backgrounds, or indeed even winning someone over who might have a more conservative outlook on things, but who would be amenable to, a more emancipatory outlook. And I think the way that this is able to perpetuate itself, and that there is no necessary escape from this, I don't think there's a kind of necessary endpoint to this, is just that, to refer to Habermas and legitimation crisis, is that for him, the escape valve there, the way that system works, is civic privatism, that people can always just withdraw into private life. And that remains the case. That's why this is why things haven't come to a head, despite the 2008 crisis, despite all the dislocations that we've had, both political and economic and so on. And even the advanced state of kind of social decay doesn't provoke revolution is just because people are able to withdraw into private life, indeed into your 4 Fs, which I think is a very neat way of putting it. So I guess to wind my way to a question, I mean, the political outlet, I said to you when we discussed this before, but it seems to me you're pushing towards a kind of anti-globalization movement, but good. And I wonder whether that is, to put it to you again, that is what you're basically arguing for. And I want to propose maybe kind of an alternative, which is that the attempt at disengagement might be productive. That to rather than to say, well, no, you need to be interested in politics, get involved in the current thing, be angry about this, but to actually, to a certain extent, I don't want to say tail, but seek to lead in some way, or those phenomena that are expressed in attempt at withdrawal, some sense from this hyper politics, right? So I mean, just to think of one example, the kind of anti-work movement, which is basically a refusal of work, whatever, is it, I think, and there are other elements, for example, on the right in terms of post-liberalism, which also evince an attempt to kind of withdraw, seek community, emphasize questions of virtue or dignity as against the kind of accelerated market and the marketplace of ideas, of social media and so on. And whether there might not be something in that might be the maybe not the bottom of the well, or the utter moment of despondency, but just that there are that those elements of disengagement might be politically productive.
Yeah, I think that the disengagement is definitely productive. I think that some profound disengagement is necessary before re-engagement is possible. And that's a big part of why with this book, I really try to stay with the despair in the book rather than try to move on from it in this book. I think that there is some period of time that we have to be despondent before we can move on, because if we don't stay with it long enough, when we try to get back in, we'll just end up coming back to the things that we've previously been in. If we don't have a long enough break where we are forced to develop different institutional forms, different ways of surviving as intellectuals, if we just immediately try to jump right back in out of a rush, out of a desire to do harm reduction or something, I think that will not work. I do think that there's one of the things that really worries me is that people are going to come back into politics or back into these other things from an ironic standpoint. Indeed, Chris's point that this is probably what already happened, I think, is a big part of the story. That there's a set of people who dropped out in the 80s and 90s, Gen Xers who did this before I was paying attention, that they dropped out, and then because they found it too unpleasant to be out, they came back in, but they came back in an insincere, not fully serious way. And this would maybe be a little bit related to this question of authenticity. I don't think it's a problem because it's inauthentic. I think it's a problem because it's, again, a symptom of failed imagination, that people who get into this despair, if they find it too psychologically unpleasant to be in despair, they will have to come out of it for psychological reasons, for reasons of personal survival. And so they will then talk themselves into something, not because they really are committed to it in terms of values or because they really believe in it politically, but as a personal thing to get them out of whatever a dark pit of personal misery that they're in. And I think this is a big threat to, even insofar as I have a project, my project, is that if we debilitate people's capabilities and we debilitate their mental health and we put them in psychologically such a vulnerable position that they have to have these attachments as a way of getting out of that position of vulnerability, then those people aren't going to be able to participate in any kind of intellectual project or any kind of political movement in an effective way, because their participation will be mainly motivated by psychology and mental health, by whatever it is that they need to do to get through the day. And this getting through the day problem, which becomes the justification for so much consumerism. People have to go and get a coffee because otherwise the day is unbearable, genuinely is unbearable. I think this is increasingly what's driving people's politics, is to not have a politics or to not be engaged in these different Fs is unbearable. And so there is this need to talk oneself into something. My brother, who is not in politics, has an expression. He says that you have to drink just a little bit of the Kool-Aid. You know that it's Kool-Aid, but you have to drink just a little bit of it, because otherwise it's too unbearable and you can't go on. You can't get through the day. You know that it's Kool-Aid and you know that it's not good for you, but you've got to drink just a little bit of it, because the alternative to drinking it is to meet your demise. And what I almost use the word hope. What I would like to be the case, what I would like to be true, is that we can be in despair politically without making that personal, and without becoming so personally miserable that we become unable to act in a constructive way. And I think a big problem with the actual existing left is that it doesn't recognize this as a problem. It thinks that if people are miserable and they have mental health issues and they're psychologically very unstable, that all of that means that they have more critical potential or revolutionary potential. They're more likely to act outside of the system. And that is, even insofar as it's true, it's certainly not constructive. And so I think that there's a question for me, and this is an open question, whether despair can exist in a political sense without this personal aspect that drives people into extreme drug use, that drives people into lifestyles that are incompatible with constructive politics.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, and I'm also really interested in this question of irony, I guess, that kind of came out of both Chris and Alex's question, but also it's not so far away from. It occurs to me that when Geoff was talking about that silly baffler thing, commoditize your dissent or whatever, it's still this kind of strange layering of things that happens in this kind of post-ironic politics and stuff. Which I think that is super interesting. Anyway, I sort of promised myself I wouldn't say anything, so I'll stop. But we've run exactly somehow perfectly to an hour, but I still think we want to spend a few minutes, just 5 or 10. If you guys. Chris, Geoff, Alex, if things are you want to chip in now, that just a free for all from the reflections on the discussion and so on.
I wanted to say something about you rule out the possibility of revolution, Ben, in the book, and you talk about the crisis of democracy, and you just mentioned that democracy and capitalism are really closely tied. Modern universal suffrage capitalism, democracy, is a phenomenon of the capitalist era. It didn't really exist before that. And I wanted to maybe ask you about liberalism and democracy, because there I felt like maybe it's a little interchangeable, and the hyphenated liberal democracy. We seem to still be in a crisis. I'm very much aware we're talking about a year away from the US election next year. Likely there's going to be a major formal legitimation crisis. In other words, a constitutionally contested election. It seems like we're headed towards that. Trump being inaugurated in jail or something like that. Or in Mar-a-Lago and house arrest, whatever it's going to be, that there's likely to be a worse crisis next year than in 2016 or 2020, right? Without that necessarily being a crisis of capitalism or of a crisis of democracy per se, but definitely this way of doing politics, the parties and the elections, this kind of thing, it seems like inevitable that there's going to be something of a crisis, don't you think?
Well, yeah, I certainly think there could be a big mess in 2020.
It's not like Biden has stabilized things, right? It's not like, we're stabilized. No, right?
Yeah, I think the crisis is chronic in that I think it can have these episodes, these moments, without any of them actually terminating the thing. And that's a big theme in the book, the idea of a legitimation crisis that's chronic, that has lots of these moments that look like acute or existential moments, but always, in retrospect, turn out to not have been that, and to have been much less important than they're given by everybody at the time and in the immediate aftermath. We kind of talk ourselves into the idea that these moments are existential, I think, in large part to make the crisis feel politically meaningful in a way that it otherwise would not be. When January 6th happens, you have to confront it as not actually being what it is everyone's saying that it is, and of just being a bunch of disorganized people who wandered into a building and then were escorted out. It's not a coup attempt. It doesn't actually pose a threat to the regime. Yet, in one sense, it's a legitimation crisis because you have a contested election. But in the kind of 20th century sense, if there's an acute threat of actual revolution or violence or regime change, it never rose to that kind of level. And I think 2024 is likely to look more like it's acute, but to still not be at all acute. In that sense, I don't think that there's any real possibility in 2024 of American representative democracy collapsing. And I think that a lot of the narratives around that we're hearing come mainly from people who are trying to terrify people into voting for Joe Biden.
Yeah. Any other comments, Geoff? Alex?
I had a point of, if I can go ahead, about imagination, right? And I mean, the problem is obviously when you complain about lack of imagination, or the other term that this sort of discussion goes under is the kind of end of utopia, the end of utopian thinking. So people tend to tell you to fuck off and why don't you make up something? Why don't you go imagine something? Which but I think the issue is, if we actually think about it seriously, is that most people, even those not the political professionals, but just people in general, are that their imagination is basically to go back to 1963 or somewhere around there, and that's across the political spectrum, and might pick different aspects of that conjuncture that they want to return to, but that's basically what is looked for, right? And you I even see perverse versions of this in places where it makes no sense. I mean, in Brazil, for example, that there was no golden age, right? You can get in Argentina, which just had elections, and they kind of maybe did have a sort of golden age, so you can be a little bit nostalgic there. But so anyway, the point is that it's kind of across the board, and I wonder how that connects to ultimately the failure of left populism, which has kind of departed the scene, because its main problem was an inability to even broach rupture with the political forms that it depended on. So whether that's the European Union or the Labour Party or the Democrats in the US, I think in all cases that's probably the unifying thread behind those failures. And whether the limited the imagination being social democracy being complicit with that unwillingness to broach rupture, that those forms delivered the goods before, so why can't they deliver it again?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from just a lack of awareness of how contingent the post-war situation was, how much it was a function of there being these world wars and the disruptive effect that those wars had on capital mobility, the mass mobilization armies that were created, and then the huge audience of veterans that demanded things from the state and had military training and were comfortable with violence and were terrifying to states. These are contingent factors, and people are not willing to do the things that are necessary to recreate those situations. People will talk about the 50s and 60s. They're not willing to redo the 30s and 40s to get the 50s and 60s. So I think that is a big part of why that return argument doesn't work. But also it's very understandable that people who don't have a great level of historical familiarity with that period would have that position. And it's also understandable how people with a lot of historical familiarity would have it, because they're constantly thinking about it. They're very passionate about that period. They love it. There's something about it that is attractive to them about it. Historians have thought, and historians who study particular periods always want their periods to be relevant on some level. They want to think that their interests and passions are important. It's difficult for them to fully let go of that. And these two groups of people, the people who know too much and the people who don't know enough about history, are often very good friends with each other, and they help each other to deceive one another about the relevance of a historical period to contemporary politics. I think that this is why when we start talking about my project is purely anti-globalization, I always push back a little bit, because if you disrupt or just break globalization, the ways that you can do that are very limited and very violent and very nasty. And so if people want to just break it, they have to be clear on what that involves and what that would mean and the consequences of that. And for that reason, I always make the case that it would really be better if we could transcend the representative, liberal democratic nation state that isn't able to govern the flows. If we could make something that could actually manage these flows and put them to work for people, that would of course be better. The issue is that that's incredibly hard to do. And every time that anyone has tried to do anything like that, they've just produced something that makes it even worse, that actually just greases the wheels for all of it and makes all of it run smoother with less disruption. And because of this, there's no confidence in anyone proposing anything multilateral anymore. The parties and politicians who propose multilateral strategies get nothing in elections because no one believes that there's actually any real possibility of doing anything like that. And those parties have overwhelmingly professional class bases. They don't reach down to the working class. They don't generate any kind of energy with working people. And so this has become a huge part of the impasse, that multilateral projects have no political juice, they have no political gas in the tank, and the unilateral projects have a concealed implication, which is a world war. They require a world war to work. And that's something nobody has really reckoned with.
If I could say something, Ben, what about proletarian socialist internationalism? What about what existed back in the day of high Marxism before World War I, when there was a very globalized world system and when there was a migratory working class, a lot of immigration, but also a lot of migration, and people would move back and forth. I always like to point out that most Italians who came to the United States to work went back.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, I would say about that period, you had a much greater prevalence of civil society organizations and a much greater amount of time available for those kinds of organizations and energy available for those organizations than people seem to have now. Not just because all of their time is taken up with work, but also because of the forms of amusement and distraction that now exist outside of the working hours and which deplete time and energy that would otherwise be available for those purposes. Yeah, things like television and the phone.
People were working 10-hour days, 6-day weeks back then.
Yes, but they had nothing else to do when they got home except go and hang out with other people.
Right.
That was all they could do, and that or read a book, if they could get one.
Yeah. Geoff, I'm just aware if you want to have any last thoughts before we wrap it up, and reflecting on all that's been said.
Yeah, I mean, it's just on my mind because I just wrote a long piece about Chile for American Affairs, which people can read. But what's been interesting there, and I make a case in the piece as to why. I mean, there are obviously many ways that Chile and the United States are not comparable, but they do have a few structural things in common, and certainly the left, many on the American left, a few years ago when Chile embarked on this process of rewriting the Constitution, scrapping this Constitution that had been put in, unlike the American Constitution, relatively recent, put in place in 1980, which was the result of a level of massive street protests that that did sort of take aim at the basic structure. You talk in your book about and mentioned here that basically in America, what happens is people sort of say that the system sucks, but then they're like, when they're actually like, do you want to like change the means by which senators are elected? Everybody's like, no, absolutely not, no way. So people are very allergic to reforms. In Chile, that all of that was on the table. And so, what's kind of interesting, just summing up, is that it was certainly taken as this this kind of model that American leftists should look to. It kind of feeds into this thing you hear a lot on the left, which you talk about, and I mean you're sort of dismissive of, where you point out that like a lot of the things that the left says, well, in order for us to actually, I mean, first of all, it becomes this kind of circular thing, because it's like, in order for us to actually win and do the stuff we want to do, we have to reform the system. But of course, how are we going to reform the system if we can't win first? But then you point out, even in these European countries that like have many of the things structurally that the left says it wants for America, like the left doesn't actually do that much better. So in any case, in the Chilean example, they really, take aim at, for example, they have a Senate there that is, similarly sort of, unrepresentative and has many of the same problems that our Senate does. And, so that was one of the things that the constitutional reform took aim at. There are many others. But, the point is, so there was this attempt that, started with this massive popular uprising, led to this whole process. And, the results have been pretty terrible. Basically the new constitution dramatically failed when put to referendum. Then a new constitutional assembly was voted in that was, actually, more right-wing than the people who had written the 1980 Constitution. And so then they will be voting on that, which will probably also fail at the ballot box. And so basically they'll be back to this Constitution that, somewhere around, at this point, 5 years earlier, there was this massive popular uprising that, the whole impetus of which was to sort of tear that up and rebuild from the ground up. And so, on the basis of a kind of rethinking of democracy or a new understanding of how democracy should work. So, it seemed like a kind of fever dream of like what an American leftist would want to happen. And then it sort of becomes this like, be careful what you wish for. Because in fact, if this new constitution were to be passed, which it looks like it won't, but if it were to be passed, it might actually be sort of more reactionary than the previous one. So, it just strikes me as an interesting case of where, something clearly broke in the system. There was this kind of, and in this country that was kind of identified with this sort of end of history neoliberal consensus, everybody sort of content enough to keep the system in place, and and also was not a place that was, I mean, by every measure was quite successful. I mean, even I think even sort of people very critical of neoliberalism would have to concede that the Chilean version was certainly not the most disastrous or most brutal that you can find in the region. But in any case, it strikes me as a kind of weird, sort of alternative trajectory that's worth looking at. Although the results are so sort of equivocal and, seem to lead us to exactly the same place that you're describing. So I don't know, I don't know if you've looked at that case, but, I think it also raises this question of, I haven't thought about it that much this way, but, is this simply the case of, because the level on which your analysis operates, even though you're looking at the particularities of the American system, is the kind of global level, does that mean that kind of all of these types of results that seem to kind of, not really get us anywhere new, even though they might seem briefly like they really are, is that just all to be ultimately ascribed to this, this basic predicament that you lay out in the book?
Yeah, I think in the Chilean case, from what I understand, and I'm sure there are people who are more on top of Chilean politics than I am, but from what I understand, they loaded that constitution up with a lot of professional class Easter eggs that made it.
Yeah, very much McGovernization as you describe it.
Yeah, I think they McGovernized the hell out of all of that. I think that was a huge mistake. They blew their opportunity as a result of that. We all should learn something from that, but we don't learn. People don't learn. They don't make any progress. And they'll look at that and they'll just blame the local Chileans for being insufficiently progressive and blame the workers in Chile for being insufficiently progressive. And then that will become their justification for producing a politics that is even more ineffective and unlikely to deliver anything for anybody. In terms of how much this applies outside the United States, I am cautious because I don't know so much about every society. I've lived in the UK, I've lived in the United States. I have some passing familiarity with some contexts, but I don't know everything about every society. I do think that part of what makes the American case a little bit distinctive is that there's this very, very long history of this Constitution to the point where people conflate being American with supporting the Constitution or with supporting the political system, that American identity is politically informed more than it is ethnic or nationalist or religious. Despite what everybody recently has been saying, I think all of that has been a kind of academic gloss over a reality that being American has always been about being committed to a particular form of Republican government created and instantiated by the founders. There are, I think, some other democracies that are similarly old. I think in those democracies, it works a little bit different. Like, for instance, in the British case, it's very much about refusing the revolution. Everybody else went crazy and did something. The French did something that was nonsense, and the Germans did something that was nonsense, and the Soviets did something that was nonsense. But this is the system that says no to all of that, because the British democracy is the best thing that you can do. It's not very good, but it's better than these other things that people try, a kind of anti-utopian, kind of Humean empiricist attitude that the British have, that I think also makes their democratic structure very deeply embedded and hard to dislodge or challenge discursively relative to other places. So in terms of, I look around the world, what democracies are old enough that there might be that kind of attitude in those places. I look at countries like Canada or Australia, New Zealand. Those I think are straightforward. Some of the Scandinavian countries have had universal suffrage for a very long time, democracy for a very long time, potentially with a brief interruption in World War II, but I'm not inclined to count that against them. Maybe I should. I'm not inclined to. Then you got countries like Germany, where part of the democracy is as old as the Second World War, but another part is just 30 years old and really doesn't have any kind of roots. And I think that's a country that very clearly is not like this, and therefore other things can happen there that can't happen in the United States or in the UK. Similar kind of, France is a country that changes its regime out all the time historically, and therefore being French has nothing really to do with any particular political commitment to monarchism or republicanism of any particular form. So this category of embedded democracy is not an American exceptionalist category, but it's a category that can only, I think, really apply to democracies that are old enough that to a very substantial degree, the way in which the people think of themselves as citizens is shaped by a political commitment rather than by some kind of ethnic ethno-nationalism or religious nationalism. And I think at this point in the UK, I don't think that you could characterize that as an English ethno-state or as a white ethno-state. It's a British Union that thinks of itself as having a set of Westminster unionist institutions and being united on that basis. Though it is true that in the United States and in the UK, people have tried to displace that framing and change it and impose a more nationalist or ethnic or religious kind of way of thinking. I don't think that's gone deep at any point in any of these places. I think a lot of professionals have talked themselves into the idea that the United States is some kind of conflict between people who think in racial terms and people who think in religious terms and people who think in some other kind of humanist terms. But I don't think that that really is the case on any fundamental level. I think at bottom, ordinary people in the United States and the UK have a political commitment to democracy as they understand it. And that is the reason why it's very, very difficult for would-be authoritarians or would-be anybody even who has a different or creative idea about politics to get anything going in those contexts.
Ben, could I challenge you on that a little bit? Just maybe as a final thought, which is, what about the revolution? There was an English Revolution. There was, right? And there was an American Revolution. What about Vivek Ramaswamy saying, he's committed to 1776. He's an American by choice. He's signing up for the revolution, right? What about that as a civic identity, as opposed to...
I see that as a very anti-tyranny, anti-kings, anti-authoritarianism, but understood through the lens of tyranny specifically and not totalitarianism.
Right. So the
at what
second
point in the book I make that too. Yeah.
Second part of it is Woodrow Wilson. You talked about commitment to something 200 or 300 years old. What about something 100 years old? What about the new freedom? What about Woodrow Wilson saying, actually, we don't live in 1776 anymore. We have the new freedom. And there's a fourth branch of government. And we pay lip service to the Constitution, but we're not really living in the Constitution. We're living in this new thing due to industrial capitalism. And that's been the source of a lot of political conflict in the United States that's still playing out now, right? Where the Democrats basically came around through FDR to embracing this, and the Republicans have said, wait a minute, we don't accept this. Or we kind of accept it, but not so fast, not so much. Right? We beg to differ. We kind of accept it, but we beg to differ. Isn't that still rattling around somewhere? Not only in the imagination or in the memory, but in social reality, in people's
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, I think there is a thought that there's been a perversion of the revolution, or that there's been a perversion of the American system over time, that people have failed to live up to what the founders gave them, that things like the Federal Reserve are some kind of a corruption point where something new is introduced that fundamentally distorts or ruins the thing, and then that's backread onto the first and second Bank of the United States. I think there are some people who have that kind of view. I don't think that that's most people, or at least for most people, it doesn't take that kind of precise and sort of Federal Reserve related form. But I do think there's a general feeling that that there has been a failure, that something has not worked. The trouble is, if you just were to try to go back to the institutions of the early 1800s, that would not work. And insofar as that results in a kind of return attitude to a pre-Federal Reserve, 19th century America, I don't think that has legs. If it can generate a commitment to something else, and I think you're right to point out that with FDR, it generated a commitment to something else. And I think when Bernie Sanders' best, when he talked about fulfilling, say, FDR's second Bill of Rights, that was probably the most muscular version of the Sanders thing, and the thing that had the most legs. I think that the trouble is that we have gotten to a point where it's very, very difficult to actually pass any constitutional amendments. We have this amendment culture now that is to the point where if a presidential candidate says that their agenda is based on passing a constitutional amendment, people just go, well, that's silly. That's ridiculous. You're not going to be able to do that. And I think that is a big part of why the Sanders campaign didn't lean on that as hard as I think some of us would have liked to have seen in 2015, 16. Because ultimately this was the accusation that they didn't have a serious plan, and that it was based on being able to do ridiculous things that they wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah. Great. I mean, I want to let people go, but I think we've had an extremely interesting and sort of robust discussion here. I just want to say thanks to all of you four of the most interesting people writing about politics at the moment, for joining in and doing this. And apologies and thanks as well to the loads of people who listened despite me cocking up the initial link, so that is appreciated. And people should of course get Ben's book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and they should listen to Sublation magazine. I hope all four of these guys will be back in Sublation. They should read Sublation magazine. I hope all four of these guys will be back writing more stuff for us as well in the coming months and so on. And if you want to support as well, I think for me the most helpful thing you could do would be, in fact, to order a copy of Ben's fantastic pamphlet, which I put the link. It's only a few quid underneath this, or a few dollars, as you guys say. A few pesos, is it, Alex? In the no, it's not. Yeah, of course. But thank you so much, all four of you, for doing it. It's been extremely interesting. And thanks everyone for listening and joining in. The chat conversation has also been hilarious and very interesting. So thanks everyone, and hope to speak to you all again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you guys.